All right, fabulous macro students. We are nearing the end of the quarter. Can you believe it? We finally made it. So I have two topics, the last two chapters of the quarter of the textbook that we're going to be studying have to do with fiscal policy and monetary policy. And what this is looking at is now that we have come through the middle section of the material where we know how to measure the macroeconomy, we want to compare that to the health of the economy, diagnose it. Now that we know how to take the blood pressure, the height, the weight, temperature, all that good stuff, what does that mean? Is this economy healthy? And if it's not healthy, then how do we fix it? How do we make it better? Okay, and so that's what we're doing in this section. So I'm going to try to keep it to 2 lectures. I may have to, based on the length of the material and how far in depth I actually end up going, this may end up being possibly 3 or 4 little mini lectures. I do like to keep it relatively shorter for you so you can take breaks in between and digest the material and not forget a whole 50 minutes worth of material. So I will try and keep it in digestible units. But hang on, we're going to get through fiscal policy and monetary policy. And that's all. You're just going to have 2 chapters on this last exam. All right, so without any further ado, let me go to share my screen and I'm going to open up. I've prepared these lecture notes for you. And so hopefully you can see these. These are my lecture notes on understanding fiscal and monetary policy. And so what I've done is we're going to use this model of aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Now you saw this a little bit before when we were talking about inflation with the cost push and the demand pull types of inflation. We're going to play with this model of aggregate supply, aggregate demand just a little bit more. Now this is really straightforward because it's very, very similar to regular supply and regular demand way back in the beginning third of the class when we did supply and demand analysis. The only difference is now that we're talking about all the firms, not just the firms in the market for apples or the market for airline travel, but we're talking about all the markets, all the firms is going to be aggregate supply. So the supply curve is going to move very similar to how a regular supply curve moves. The demand curve now is taking into account not just consumers, but also people who are buying our GDP, people, groups, agents that are buying our GDP, to include firms that are buying materials to invest. So investment goods are going to be included. So our firms are in aggregate demand, as is our government. Our government buys a lot of stuff from our markets. So they're an active participant in all of our markets as well. As well, we're going to take into account the effect of the rest of the world in net exports. So the aggregate demand curve, and you can see that right here. We're going to use the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to diagnose the healthy economy. Things that will shift aggregate demand right here, the beginning part of our notes says that aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And that means exports minus imports. Okay, exports are goods that we sell to other people around the world. Imports are foreign goods that we buy. We could have purchased domestic goods, but instead we bought imports. And so that's a subtraction to our GDP. And you saw this when you learned about the expenditures function for GDP in the last block of material as well. Okay, so I'm going to break down the aggregate demand because there's 4 different groups that are our demanders, that are buying our GDP. Let's look at them a little bit separately and ask, okay, what would cause them to change their behavior and to buy more or less of our GDP? All right, and one thing that affects this is wealth, not income, because income, technically speaking, is in the model. Income equals GDP in equilibrium, okay? The income approach and the expenditures approach were equal. But when wealth goes up, when our stock market starts doing really, really well, okay, that's an instance where wealth, all of a sudden we have extra money, we're going to go out and sell that, okay, or not sell it, we're going to go out and buy stuff with that wealth when we sell our stocks is what I meant. And we're going to take that surplus and we're going to go spend it and buy more stuff. So as you can see, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. I have my models here, and you set up an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model just the same way that you would for regular supply and regular demand. The only difference being that you're going to add an A in front of the supply and the demand to denote that it's aggregate. It's all aggregated, added up. Okay, so aggregate supply, upward sloping relationship between price and quantity. Now, in this case, let me point out that that's not a single price, because you can't add the price of toothpicks to the price of a new automobile, right? You would get some huge crazy price. It doesn't make sense. So in this case, the P actually represents the price level. So the P, think of that as actually like a CPI. Okay, and if the P goes up, that's an increase in the CPI, so that would be inflation. And if the P goes down in the graph on the right, that would be some deflation. Okay, so think of the P as CPI. It's the price level, not an actual single dollar amount. Okay, on the other hand, Q, the same thing. We can't add quantity of toothpicks to quantity of automobiles. So that Q is actually like total GDP. Okay, it's not number of automobiles, but it's the quantity. It's a GDP. So think of Q as GDP. Okay, measured in like dollars. Okay, kind of idea. All right. So in this case, that's a little slight difference, but we still use the P and Q like we do for regular supply and demand. But when we're talking about it, when I report the results, we would say, oh, the price level went up, P went up, and the GDP went up, Q went up. Okay, so when Q goes up, we say GDP goes up. Okay, quantity of GDP, real GDP. Okay, taking out the price effect because P is the price. All right, so you can see here that an increase in wealth is one of the things that is going to shift our aggregate demand. We talk about those demand shifters, going back to original supply and demand, right? One of the things that will shift aggregate demand is wealth. Increases to the right, decreases to the left. In this case, we shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, find the new equilibrium, the red dot, and always report your results. As a result of the increase in wealth, more people are going to buy more stuff. That's going to drive up prices. We're going to have a little bit of inflation, and we're going to have a little bit more GDP. Okay, so that's the prediction of our model. Based on our model, the economists would say that when we have an increase in wealth, both our prices and our GDP would go up. That's actually demand pull inflation, right? Go back and look at what you remember from demand pull and cost push, and that's demand pull. On the other hand, over here, one of the things that I have under consumption in my notes up here, another factor that affects how much people buy, especially when we're talking big ticket items like houses, right, or new cars, are things that they finance. And so interest rates are going to be important. When interest rates rise, we see less people buying new houses. We see less people buying new cars. Okay, so here we have, in that case, that will shift the aggregate demand curve. A rise in the interest rate is a decrease in aggregate demand. Decrease, leftward shift. Because of the higher interest rate, we're going to be less inclined to buy those big ticket items. So we're going to see a decrease in demand for some aspects of GDP. What's going to happen is that lowers the price level and cuts back on our GDP. So as a result of the increase in the interest rates, according to our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we would expect to see some deflation along with a little bit of reduction in GDP. So there you go. So we're starting to get comfortable using this model, things that shift aggregate demand, one being wealth and the other being interest rates. Let's look at investment. This is when firms buy big equipment in order to grow. Okay, if the interest rate gets too high, it's not worth it to them to build a new factory, to build an expansion, to buy a big bulldozer or a big piece of equipment or a new combine for the farm, right? They would wait. And so in that case, same thing. If the interest rate goes up, we would see firms buying less too, along with the consumers. So that would also be a leftward shift in aggregate demand as shown here. So I'm not going to draw it twice. That's why I didn't draw it twice under investment, because it's right here, okay? Another part of aggregate demand, another demand shifter, actually two demand shifters, have to do with government, that other agent that is buying up our GDP, the government. And the way that government shifts the aggregate demand curve, this is actually fiscal policy, and you'll see this in just a little bit. So this is a preview of what's coming, right? When government goes out and spends more, when they build new highways, build new schools, build a new battleship, when they send people to outer space, okay, although that recent one was a commercial venture, privately funded, when we sent those 2 astronauts to land at the International Space Station, keep that in mind too. But an increase in G, if they up their spending, that's going to stimulate aggregate demand. That's an increase in aggregate demand. Increase in G will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Conversely, a decrease in G will send that aggregate demand curve to the left. So if I had said decrease in G, maybe on a homework or a quiz, something like that, or an exam, you would shift that aggregate demand curve to the left instead. In this case, G went up. Maybe we send out some stimulus checks. That next round of stimulus is going to be hitting the bank accounts pretty soon. And when that happens, people rush out and buy stuff. So when they do, that's going to increase GDP from Q1 to Q2. And that's going to increase our price level from P1 to P2. So you can see, again, demand is pulling up that inflation. Okay, not really a problem as long as we are keeping our change in inflation at or below the percentage change in our GDP. That's our rule of thumb with respect to inflation. We want to keep a lid on inflation. And what that means is don't let inflation go above our rate of economic growth. Okay, we don't have any concerns about that right now because our GDP is falling actually because of the COVID. But anyways, just something that we like to keep an eye on when we say keep a lid on inflation. Okay. One of the other tools that government has that they can choose to change in order to either stimulate or contract the economy through the use of fiscal policy is taxes. They can give us tax breaks or they can raise taxes. In this case, I asked you to consider what would happen if there was an increase in taxes. If government increases my taxes, let's say they take less out of my paycheck, or take more, let's say increase taxes, they're going to take more out of my paycheck, or I have to pay more in April 15th or whenever I pay my taxes, right? That means I have less money to spend on GDP. So an increase in taxes is going to cause a leftward shift, a decrease in aggregate demand. Government is taking my money, I'm not able to spend it, okay? So here an increase in taxes is shown as a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, new equilibrium, with the result being we're going to have some decrease in the price level, right? Some deflation, as well as a reduction in GDP, okay? So you can see that here, price level will fall and GDP will fall whenever there's an increase in taxes. If they were to give me a tax break or a tax cut, that would actually allow me to spend more, and that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So you would draw this with the aggregate demand curve going in the other direction if it had said decrease in taxes, okay? So there you go. So that's how that aggregate demand curve is going to move when we start talking about the 2 fiscal policy options that the government has to either stimulate or contract the economy. Is they can change the amount of G and they can change the amount of T. Again, G is government spending and T is taxes. And when I say T meaning taxes, it could be a wide variety of taxes to include income taxes, sales taxes, excise taxes, corporate taxes, all kinds of taxes, okay? But we just say taxes in general. A big portion is often the federal income tax, okay? All right. The last agent, economic agent, that is going to shift that aggregate demand curve is the rest of the world. And this could be either through the use of exports or imports. So what determines, to some extent, the amount of goods and services that are exported versus imported? Remember that difference between exports and imports is our trade balance. One of the things that can affect that is the value of our currency relative to another currency. So the exchange rate. And when we talk about the exchange rate, there's a whole bunch of them. We have the exchange rate with the Canadian dollar, the exchange rate with the British pound, with the euro, with the Japanese yen, right? With the Chinese yuan. There's all kinds of different exchange rates. But think about our major trading partners, the Mexican peso, for example, okay? If the exchange rate moves in our favor such that our dollar gets stronger, that sounds awesome. Americans are trained to think strong is good. We want to be the biggest, the baddest, the meanest, right? We're going to sweep those Olympics, okay? Look at USA. Wrong. A strong dollar is the worst thing for an economy, okay? A strong dollar means that our goods and services are looking more expensive to the rest of the world. It takes a lot of Japanese yen to buy our goods and services when the exchange rate is in our favor. When our dollar is getting stronger, that means that our exports are going to fall. A fall in exports, if we can't sell to the Japanese because our prices look too high, because it takes more yen to buy our products, right? That is not good for GDP. Strong dollar, bad for GDP. When is a strong dollar good? A strong dollar is awesome if you are graduating from college and going on your month trip to Europe and you want to spend your dollars all across Europe, then by all means, a strong dollar will help you. Your dollar will go super far overseas. You'll really help the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, and the British GDP. So they are hoping that you will do that when this dollar is strong. That does not help our domestic GDP then, okay? So appreciation of the US currency is what we call it when our dollar gets stronger. Here's the picture, bad for GDP, okay? What we want a weak dollar. We want so that they can gobble up our goods and services, so that if the exchange rate shifts between us and China and our dollar gets weaker, that is not losing in any way. That is winning, because now the Chinese will buy more of our stuff. Also, if the Chinese currency, the yuan, gets stronger, right? It's going to be more expensive for Americans to buy Chinese goods. So we're going to buy less Chinese goods because they got more expensive. They're going to buy more of our goods because our dollar got weaker. Yeah, that's a win-win, right? Okay, weak dollar, yes, awesome. Best thing ever for the economy. Not so good if you were planning on a trip to Beijing. Sorry about that. But I'm a little selfish and I'd rather have you spend your money here. Okay? Cool. It's something that students stumble on because they think strong is good. No, in terms of economics, a strong dollar is bad for GDP. All right. So there you go. There's the picture proving it. Okay? Now let's switch gears and let's look at, okay, now that we know the major things that will shift aggregate demand, what are the major things that will shift aggregate supply? And so think back to what were the things that shifted a regular supply curve. Things that shifted a regular supply curve were prices of inputs, technology, productivity, acts of nature. Same things, except when we talk about prices of inputs, it's not just the prices of fertilizer for apples, right? Because that's very, very micro. But we're talking about common inputs that all firms use, like gasoline, to get their products to market, the cost of shipping, right? Wages are pretty standard across the board. Everybody uses workers. So wages will affect the aggregate supply curve. In the opposite way that you might think, if wages go up, that's bad. Our firms can't produce as much because they have to pay more. Their costs have gone up and they have to cut back on production to make their budgets work, right? So here I have this picture. Increases in wages here on the left-hand side is going to cause a leftward shift in the aggregate supply. Let me scroll just a little bit here, okay? Is going to cause a leftward shift in that aggregate supply. Find the new equilibrium, report your results, and that's going to increase prices and result in a decrease in output. That's stagflation. That's that cost push inflation. We've got inflation coupled with maybe possibly a recession. Increases in wages, not good for the economy. You may be thinking selfish. Yeah, I want a pay raise, right? Well, you can be selfish. Just recognize what you're doing to our macroeconomy in the process, right? Instead, what we want is you to get pay raises because our demand is doing so well and everybody wants your product. That's going to pull up your prices. And eventually you're going to share in that in terms of the firm is going to have to pay you more to produce more, okay? So in this case, wages increasing is going to have a leftward shift in the aggregate supply. On the other hand, one of the other things that will shift a supply curve, a regular supply curve, as well as an aggregate supply curve, is technology. We all start using cell phones. We all start using, iPads and computers, and we have supercomputers that are so much faster, and all this stuff that increases our productivity. The use of Zoom has increased our productivity, right? We can have so many more meetings because we're not driving from one meeting to the next meeting, wasting gas, wasting time, right? I mean, I have Zoom meetings like at 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, then 4 o'clock, whereas I couldn't do that before because I'd have to travel between them, okay? So things like that have increased our worker productivity, and that's increasing technology. So in this case, an increase in technologies caused a rightward shift of that aggregate supply curve, moved that aggregate supply curve to the right, resulting in lower prices as well as increased output. That's awesome. That's a double win. Not only have we kept a lid on inflation by even dropping inflation, but now we've got more output. Well, that's amazing, right? So yeah, well, we love technological increases. They're really, really good. Okay, so when you see in a homework or a quiz or an exam, show what will happen with an ASAD model when there's a change in technology or productivity, you're going to shift that aggregate supply curve, either increase to the right, decrease to the left. Okay? All right, now that you know how to use the ASAD model, let me comment that this has been short run. It's the short run aggregate supply curve is the one without the SR in front of it. Some professors put the SR in front of it. It's just implied. I'm just lazy. You will always know the LRAS. 2 reasons. I always write LRAS, right? And then the other one is short run. And the LRAS is always vertical. The short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to take into account our PPF. And so the LRAS, long run aggregate supply curve, that's our threshold. That's our frontier. Okay, that's our PPF, our maximum that we could produce with all of our workers fully employed, not zero unemployment, at that natural rate, right? So the LRAS is determined based on what economists feel is the natural rate of unemployment in the economy. What is the appropriate amount of structural and the appropriate amount of frictional that our economy has found a balance at, okay? And again, the economists don't just make up this number. We look at our structural, we look at our frictional, and we go, yeah, okay, that's reasonable, that's our natural, okay? So it's based on that. And so what we do now is we add the frontier on there. That red vertical line in this case is our desired point. We want to be on our frontier. If we're on our frontier, we're hitting the LRAS. So the best possible scenario is that LRAS crosses the intersection of our short run. So the black intersection is our short run. That's where we are at the present moment. And the red line tells us where we could be in the long run if we were on our frontier. So this picture right here shows us long run macro equilibrium. This is the best world. We're at both short run and long run equilibrium. In this case, the denotation of QP, that stands for potential. That's our potential output when we are at full employment. And then UN is our natural rate of unemployment, and that equals our current rate. So if our natural is about 5, 2.5 frictional, 2.5 structural, and we notice that our current unemployment rate is 4.99, rounds enough to 5, we're good. We're going to call that we're in macro equilibrium. Yeah, baby, we're doing great. Okay, if that's the case, we're not going to do anything. We're going to just stay the course and enjoy the fact that our economy is in equilibrium. Okay, we're going to celebrate, do some victory dances. It's more likely the case, though, at any point in time, that our economy is not in macro equilibrium. It's a hard thing to hit your target exactly in some cases. A lot of times we overshoot, undershoot, go past it, come back, and we fluctuate a little bit on both sides. And that's okay. But if we end up to where the short run equilibrium is to the left of our long run, what that means is that we haven't gotten to our potential yet. This is a shortfall, a shortcoming. We have failed to reach our potential. Okay, so we have a gap. I denote the gap as the shaded green area, right? It shows that we haven't gotten to our LRAS. The gap is actually just the difference between the Q1 and the QP. So for example, if my Q1 was 450,000 and my QP, my potential was 500,000, the size of my gap would realistically be 50,000 in GDP. Okay, so that's how you would technically calculate it. Visually, I like showing the triangle. Okay, it reminds you this is what a recessionary gap looks like. My short run, the intersection, the black dot, has not gotten to the red line. Okay, gotten to the LRAS yet. Characteristics of a recessionary gap are that my current level of GDP, Q1, is less than my potential. I haven't gotten to my frontier yet. And correspondingly, I would notice that my current unemployment rate is higher. So like I said before, if my natural rate is 5%, if my current rate is 7%, what that means is I've got 2% of excess unemployment, that cyclical unemployment that we talked about in the last chapter or two, right? We have excess unemployment on not all my workers who want to work can find a job. So that's why we're falling short, right? This excess unemployment is hovering there. And so that means that we could be doing better if we got rid of this recessionary gap. We could put those workers to work and we would move to our long run, okay? On the other hand, that's two possibilities. So far we could be in macro equilibrium or we could have a recessionary gap. The third possibility is, what if we've overheated? And this is what I was talking about, if we overshoot, okay? We're doing awesome. And this is what has happened recently before COVID-19. A lot of economists were concerned because our unemployment rate dropped into the 3s. Instead of being at the 4 level, where it might have been 2% frictional, 2% structural, we were down at 3.6. Okay, so we were in an inflationary gap prior to COVID-19. Okay, so don't think we were recessionary prior to hitting COVID and everything held in a handbasket. No, we were doing great. We were coming off a very, very long expansion, one of the longest 3 in history. Okay, a top 3, right? Kind of idea. Maybe even top 2. I think it had passed top 2. I'll have to go back and look at the data. But anyways, really, really long expansionary period. And so far, we had almost overshot our goal and we're overheating. Okay, and that can be dangerous because that can kick off some excess inflation. It makes it hard to keep a lid on inflation in those situations. That's why it's called an inflationary gap. The threat of inflation is really high. Okay, and we'll show you that when we do the self-correcting mechanism in just a minute. In this case, we've gone beyond my current intersection, the black intersection of the downward sloping aggregate demand, upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. Oops, I forgot to label this LRAS, but you can do that. But you know the vertical barrier is the LRAS, okay? Anyways, so we've gone beyond. Q1 is greater than QP. You can see that over here in the yellow, right? Q1 is greater than QP. So if QP was 500,000, I'm now over here at 525,000. Okay, and again, you may think that's awesome, but it's not, because it's going to kick off inflation, and that's bad. Okay, in this case, my natural rate is higher than my current. So if my natural rate was 4 and I'm over here at 3.6 like we were, right? In that case, we have too little unemployment. That cyclical is negative, right? Negative 0.4. And in fact, our firms want to grow, but they can't because there's no pool, there's not a big enough pool of reserve workers for them to choose from. Okay, so this has its own set of issues as well. Okay, so 3 possibilities in diagnosing our economy. We could be uber healthy in the macro. We could be just a little sick on this side, right? Or we could be recovering from something and still not 100% yet, right? We've gone past, we've passed the sickness, the main part of it, but we're still a little sick, okay? So over here, inflationary gap, we're overexerting ourselves. We're gonna tire out, okay? So in this case, the question becomes then, if we're in macro equilibrium, we don't need to do anything. We're fine, stay the course. But if we notice, we detect as economists that we're in either a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap, what can we do about it? Okay, so that's this part of the notes. If the macro economy is not in equilibrium, what can we do about it? The first thing we can do is, our economy is so dynamic and so amazing that it has inherently in it the ability to correct itself. Okay, what? We can just wait it out? Yeah, the markets will correct. They will. Sounds handy dandy. Sounds like, yeah, well, let's just sit back and watch. Just cross our arms and sit back and watch this all unfold. The problem is we don't know how long that will take. Okay, there's no predicting. It could be very fast, it could be very sluggish, and very slow. In particular, our politicians that are often on a re-election cycle, they get impatient. They don't want to explain to their constituents, we're just waiting it out. We're not going to take any action. You're all good. And the constituents are screaming, do something, right? And they say, well, how long is it going to take? And the politicians go, we don't know. So no, that's a hard sell, is the wait and see approach, okay? Because of the uncertainty in how long it's going to take and the conflict perhaps where we are in the business cycle. If it's an election year, they really want to take action fast. That's why those stimulus checks went out so quickly this year in particular, because we're on an election clock, a big one, a presidential election, okay? And those politicians love showing their constituents that they're hard at work. Look, we're on top of this. Look what we got for you, okay? So although the wait and see approach does have merit and it would work, we're often too impatient to let it do so, okay? But it's worth thinking about it, okay? So what if we all got patient and we all said, we can wait this out, right? We're gonna wait and see. If we have, and this is what these two pictures are showing here, if we have an inflationary gap, like we do on the left-hand side here, the wait and see inflationary gap over here, notice the black intersection is to the right of my LRAS right here, the blue LRAS, right? We need to go to the left. We've overproduced. We need to cut back a little bit, right? In this case, if we wait it out, what's going to happen is that too little unemployment, right? That negative cyclical unemployment is going to be super duper important. It's going to put pressure on wages. Think about it. The only way that a new firm can grow is if they go steal workers from another firm. In order to get somebody to leave another firm and come to your new firm is if you offer them more. You see it? So that's going to create upward pressure on prices, or on wages, I'm sorry. And when those wages go up, that is going to increase prices. That's going to shift that aggregate supply curve to the left. So the wait and see approach shifts the aggregate supply curve. Very, very important. Hope you wrote that down. Hope you circled it, highlight, double star, triple star, whatever, okay? Wait and see approach, aggregate supply is going to shift. When we get to fiscal and monetary policy, the demand, aggregate demand is going to move. So make sure you're shifting the right curves. Okay, so here we go. And it has to do with too little unemployment or too much unemployment. So on the left-hand side, if we have that inflationary gap, the only way that new firms can grow and expand is to steal them. It becomes a battle for workers and wages go up, right? And so on. Shift that aggregate supply curve to the left. We've got that stagflation going on, higher inflation, lower output. But the good news is we have moved back to where all three curves intersect. That's long-run macro equilibrium, where the LRAS comes straight through the middle of the intersection of the X, okay? So this will correct itself. Everything will be hunky-dory, and then we just stay the course. On the other hand, if we had a recessionary gap where we were underperforming, the economy was sluggish, we have lots of people looking for jobs, right? We have excess unemployment in this case, okay? Not too little, but now excess unemployment. That puts downward pressure on wages because the firm knows they can hire someone else. They can fire someone who's earning a lot and hire someone else at a lower wage. They can replace somebody at a high salary with somebody with a lower salary and experience that cost savings. And that's going to lower their costs and allow them to produce more and sell it at a lower price. Okay? So in this case, when there's a recessionary gap, wages will fall, causing that aggregate supply curve to shift to the right until eventually we hit long-run equilibrium and it'll stop. The process will stop because there's no excess unemployment anymore, right? And so that's the wait and see approach. It's the pressure on wages to either rise and fall to move the aggregate supply to the LRAS, okay? Now, that's a nice little story, but like I said, it very rarely plays itself out in reality. We get too impatient. If we're not willing to wait it out, here's the other options. Okay, two sets of groups can decide how to stimulate or contract the economy. They're on top of it, which is really comforting. It should be for Americans that we don't just have like one king or one dictator that's deciding everything. We've got two very talented groups, very experienced groups dealing with this, watching, monitoring in their separate locations even, right, independently. So it's two different sets of eyes, which is even more comforting to me, I think, because you're going to see different things, right? The one set is in DC. That is our federal government. And the federal government, the president and the two houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the three of them can choose to, through the use of government spending and taxation, can manipulate the economy, and we call that fiscal policy. Keep in mind, they're sitting together in DC hammering out legislation about stimulus checks. Okay, just a foreshadowing of what's coming next. In the next lecture, I'm going to deal with that other group that their headquarters is in New York City, right on Wall Street, right in the heart of the stock market, where there's a lot of economic activity. New York being one of our biggest cities, a lot of commerce and trade and production going on there. So we've got the Federal Reserve and a bunch of people with PhDs in macroeconomics in particular, not sports economists like me, right? We got these really high-powered, really super-duper smart, with tons of experience in economics people sitting in New York City, watching the economy, monitoring the economy, and they have a separate set of tools. So it's really kind of cool because the federal government has two sets of tools. The FOMC and the Federal Reserve has three sets of tools. So combined, we've got 5 sets of tools and 2 different sets of eyes with a lot of expertise, very, very smart, intelligent people in these groups. So you should be comforted. Okay, we will look at the Federal Reserve and their monetary policy, their 3 monetary policy tools in the next lecture. I do want to wrap this one up here pretty shortly, okay? But let's look at what Congress and the president can do, okay? And so they can, in response to, well, first of all, what does an expansionary and a contractionary gap look like and how they would do this? With the fiscal policy, okay, when you're in an expansionary gap, or I'm sorry, expansion, oh, I wrote that wrong. Dang it, I wrote that wrong. It's contractionary policy. Hold on, I'm gonna change this. The cool thing is, see, I can change this. Expansionary policy, typo, and contractionary policy. Make sure you're putting the right adjectives with the right nouns. Gaps are recessionary or inflationary. Policies are expansionary or contractionary. So you can see that I have it written. I'm going to hit save now. Okay. Here, you can see that the expansionary fiscal policy and the contractionary fiscal policy, right? You use expansionary fiscal policy when you see a recessionary gap. So recessionary gaps require expansionary policy. We're underproducing, so we need to expand. Expansionary policy, right? The way that the Congress and the president can do that is either by increasing G, going out and spending more, or lowering our taxes so that I can spend more, right? Okay, so either an increase in G or a decrease in T will shift that aggregate demand curve to the right and will move us to our long run out of the recession, eliminating the recessionary gap and moving us to long run macro equilibrium. So that is how you would show expansionary fiscal policy, which would be applied to a recessionary gap. On the other hand, if the federal government is looking at a inflationary gap, right, and notice that we've overheated, they would want to apply contractionary policy. You want to contract the economy, draw me back to that long-run aggregate supply curve, shift that aggregate demand curve to the left by either cutting their government expenditures or increasing taxes so that I can't spend as much either. Okay, so those are both examples of contractionary policy, and how you would show that on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve is you would shift that aggregate demand curve to the left. Cool. All right, just the last little bit in this lecture, and then I'll wrap up, take a break, and then come back with the monetary policy lecture, right? There's a little bit of calculations in here. We can actually calculate by how much do we need to change government spending, and by how much do we need to change taxation? Okay, so we have two handy dandy formulas to help us. At the heart of this, it depends on to what extent do Americans like to spend their income versus save their income. And so the marginal propensity to consume tells us of an extra, let's say $100. If I were to give somebody $100, how much of that would they spend versus how much of that would they save? Okay, so an MPC could be something like 90%. 0.9 is a pretty standard MPC, where you would spend 90% and you might think, you know, I'm going to leave 10% aside for the rainy day or something, okay? That 10% becomes the MPS, the marginal propensity to save. So you can only do two things with your income. You can either spend it or you can set it aside and spend it later. So savings is really just deferred consumption. You're going to spend it in a future period, aren't you? Okay, so the MPC plus the MPS, they're both percentages, so they're going to add to 1. So like I said, if the MPC is 0.8, meaning that we spend 80%, that means that we save 20. 0.8 plus 0.2 is going to equal 1. So as long as you know 1, if you know either the MPS or the MPC, you can find the other one, just subtract from 1, right? If the MPS is 0.25, well, that's going to tell you intuitively the MPC is 0.75. If I'm saving 25, well, the only other thing I can do is spend the other 75, right? So the MPC is 0.75. Okay, now the fiscal policy multiplier. What this means is that every time the government injects money into the economy through the use of government spending or taxation, okay, $1 that they inject into the economy does more than $1 worth of improvement to the economy. And that's a good thing, okay? Because what happens is, if you give me $100, I go spend 80 of it at my neighbor's local business, they now have $80. They're going to spend 80% of the 80. They're going to spend 64 on the next business down the line. Then they're going to have 80% of 64, and so on. And so there's this multiplier effect that when the government injects money into the economy increases, yes, by the original amount, but also these rounds of spending that also get kicked off. Okay, so there's this multiplier effect, and that multiplier, how big that multiplier is, depends upon the MPC and the MPS. If an MPC is really high, your multiplier is big. We're good spenders. That's awesome. Go spend like crazy, people. If your MPC is smaller, then that multiplier is smaller. You're going to see a smaller expansion, okay? And we sometimes see that if people are really nervous, like the COVID-19, and there's a lot of uncertainty, or the Great Recession, people get really nervous. They don't like to spend it. They want to save it because they're not sure what's happening down the road. So if people get conservative in that way, that's going to make the multiplier less and make our policy less effective, okay? So it's really important that we go spend that money. Go spend those stimulus checks, people. All right, but anyways, so the multiplier is the rate at which that spending is going to kick off a lot more spending. The multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or conversely, 1 over the MPS, because the MPS is equal to 1 minus the MPC, okay? So you can do that. You can calculate the multiplier. And again, here's the thing. $1 of government spending generates M dollars of increase in the economy. All right. Then additionally, once you know how to calculate the multiplier, the formulas that you're going to need, and you have to calculate them separately. There's two formulas. There's one for government spending. There's one for taxation. The one for government spending says that the ultimate change in GDP is equal to the multiplier times however much they increase their spending by. On the other hand, for taxation, the change in GDP is equal to negative, because taxation works the opposite way. An increase in taxes is a decrease in GDP. So you have to show that with a negative sign, negative M. We add this MPC in here times the change in taxes. And what that means is, because there's an extra round, when you give somebody a change in taxes, on that first round, they're going to withhold it instead of spend it all, okay? And so anyways, for the reasons for that, this is the algebra that you're going to use. So let me show you two examples in this case. Consider on the left-hand side, we need to expand the economy. So we want to figure out what is the change in G that we would need to expand the economy by 25,000. We figured out, oh my gosh, we're almost there. We're 25,000 short. We need to increase our economy by 25,000. That's why this is a positive. Okay, notice over here it's negative because we're going to contract. I need to increase the economy by 25,000. My multiplier, or my MPC, is 0.9. When I put that into my multiplier formula, 1 over 1 minus MPC, I'm going to get 1 over 0.1. That's my MPS. 1 over the MPS is going to give me 10. So for every dollar that the government injects into the economy, it's going to generate $10 of output. Okay, good to know. So now, to get rid of a $25,000 gap, I know my change in GDP. I know the multiplier is 10. How much change in G do I need to have? So I can solve for change in G, divide both sides by 10, and look, I only need to increase my government expenditures by 2,500 to get rid of a gap of much bigger, 25,000. 1/10 of the size of the gap is what I need to inject to fix the gap. Isn't that cool? That multiplier is really cool. All right, let's look at the math on the other side. If we had used taxes instead, over here, let's say, and I just made these numbers up, you'd be given them in a problem, for example. In this case, let's say that we have a gap of 50,000. We've overshot by 50,000. So we need to come back. We need to contract our economy. Oh, shoot. This one says expansionary fiscal policy. It's actually contractionary, okay? This is supposed to be contractionary fiscal policy in this case. So we're contracting that negative sign, okay? And what we're gonna do in this case, our MPC is 0.8. That gives me a multiplier of 5. I put it into the formula. My multiplier is now 5. I know my change in GDP is negative 50. I put the negative sign out front. My M is 5. My MPC is 0.8, and then times delta T. When I multiply this all out, this becomes negative 4, and then I divide both sides by negative 4, negative divided by negative, this is positive. I need to increase taxes, right? Increase taxes by 25,000 in order to contract the economy. This is not expansionary, this should be contractionary, sorry. In order to contract the economy. All right, any questions? Oh, obviously, if you have questions, reach out. Let's do it another way. Let's say, in this case, right, oh, it's the same one. Oh, dang it. I had the other example. I copied in the other one. Hold on one second. I'm going to hook up. I'm going to do this live. Let's see if I can, how fast I can do this. And so, when I go into here, it's the same example. There was another example where I solved for, in this case, I knew the amount of the change in G, and I solved for the change in GDP that would result from that. So now, let me see, since these two are the same, I'm going to get rid of this one, backspace, okay? I'm going to insert, see if I can do this. Pictures. No. See, I just connected my iPad, so I was trying to do my music. Okay, I'm gonna do pictures. Bear with me. I'm gonna find my iPad. I'm gonna go to my pictures. And I'm gonna try and find. Oh, shoot. Which one is it? Is it this one? Nope, it's not gonna let me. Oh, darn. Anyways, I had one more example, but imagine, and let's see if I can type this out maybe, okay? So imagine, in this case, if I can spell, we knew that the change in G was, let's say, 25,000, okay? We're gonna increase government spending by 25,000. By how much would GDP change if the MPC is equal to, and let's do 0.8, okay? So in this case, right, we know the change in G, and we want to find the change in GDP, okay? So in this case, my multiplier, M, little m, multiply, is going to equal 1 divided by 0.2, okay, which is going to be 5. I know these because I've done these enough. So my multiplier is 5. So now my formula is change in GDP is going to equal M times change in G. And so in this case, change in GDP is going to equal 5, right, times, in this case, 25,000. They went out and they bought something for 25,000. What's the ultimate effect on GDP? Well, that's going to be then change in GDP is going to be 125,000. Right? So that's another way you can use this formula. If you know the change in G, you can predict the change in GDP. If you know the change in GDP, you can figure out what the change in G has to be to get rid of that gap. Okay? All right, so that's where I'm going to stop for now. You can use this formula, play with this formula. There's some practice in the homework that will let you do that, right? Hopefully. And so with that, I'm going to stop the recording here, going to upload it for you, and then I will get started on that monetary policy probably after dinner. It's might be getting kind of late today. But anyways, hopefully I'll get them uploaded so you can get that next homework in. All right. Thanks for listening and keep working hard. I do appreciate how hard you guys have been working. I know it, and we're almost there, so hang in there. All right. I'm going to stop my share, and then I'm going to end my video.